off the coast of Chile, had severe scurvy on board, and had to make a decision about where to go get provisions to address this issue. One of them wanted to go to California, but there was issues going on in terms of economy and social issues at that time, and the other one said they wanted to come to Hawaii. In the end, they came to Hawaii. And they ended up off of Kealakekua Bay, and they were trading with a number of people who came on board in their canoes. And while they were at Kealakekua Bay, a whale was spotted. They lowered their whale boats, pursued it, and they also were pursued by about 40 canoes. They killed the whale, were able to bring it back, and the whalers were only interested in the oil, whereas the Hawaiians actually removed the meat, and it's recorded that they had a great festival or feast afterwards. This is the first recording we have of whaling in Hawaii. So Captain Gardner was on the Balena, who was one of the ships that came in 1819, and he provides the first account of taking native Hawaiians with him to go to go whaling. And he obviously took them from several different islands that he stopped at while in the islands, and then proceeded to go back to New England, and the following year he brought them back. And he paid them off primarily in clothes. So when the Balena and the Equator came in 1819, there already was a system in place for the contracting of Native men for service abroad. And that initial system dates to Kamehameha. And we have good records and descriptions of contracts being brokered in the 1890s onward, in which a person had to get permission first from the chief, and then they had to get permission from the island governor in order to enter into a contract. And those early contracts are mostly associated with the Hudson's Bay Company, but they also reflect the system that was used for shipping of seamen for whaling and merchant vessels as well. We know that the Hawaiian shipping articles, which is basically a crew list, that system was in place by the 1830s, and although most people thought it didn't occur until the 1840s, we actually have descriptions from the 1830s showing that it was already in place. At that time, a captain had to pay a bond for every native seaman that they took aboard. And initially it started out around $100 per person. It eventually got up to $300 per individual. The purpose of the bond was to ensure that the captain felt that some monetary need to return the native seamen. The early contracts with the Hudson's Bay Company basically said, you need to treat the men well, you need to feed them, clothe them, and you need to return them at the end of their contract. The bonds for the shipping of native seamen basically had the same sort of provisions. You were supposed to take care of them, and you were to pay this bond up front to ensure that you would return them. The agreement, or that when you entered into a contract, said that you needed to return that individual within a certain number of months or years. Early on, whaling voyages coming to Hawaii often averaged 4 years. So the bonds were intended for that entire length. Later on, the voyages got shorter and shorter, so sometimes voyages got as short as 3 months. But in the early years, and the early decades actually, it was at least about 4 years. The government only allowed native seamen to ship from the ports of Lahaina and Honolulu until 1845, and then they opened the port of Hale at that time to allow native seamen to ship from there. It was illegal to ship from any other port. That's not to say that nobody ever didn't do anything illegal. And we know that various people did ship that if you did not return a seaman. And that penalty became more severe as time went on, less severe early on, and much more difficult to enforce early on than it was later. When we talk about native seamen as they are represented in the literature and the documents of the time, they are using the term to refer to any indigenous person in the Pacific. So when they say these are Hawaiian shipping articles, they do not make a distinction between whether that person is indigenous Hawaiian heritage versus they are Pacific Islander from somewhere else. Their main difference is what they want to distinguish between is whether this is an indigenous person from the Pacific versus this is a foreigner. So both the indigenous and the foreigners are recorded on the same shipping articles. And they are also both recorded on the foreign crew list. So a vessel coming out of New Bedford, for example, would have a crew list that's filled out at that port. Everybody who's on board at that time would be recorded on that crew list. Anybody who deserts during the voyage, their name would be recorded as having deserted. Anybody who got picked up and shipped from another port during the length of that voyage, whether that was off of Peru or in Hawaii or wherever, they were added to the crew list. So they were actually on those vessels that were coming out of New England or even from Europe or Australia or so forth, would have had basically two crew lists if they came to Hawaii. They would have the crew list from where they originated, and then the crew list from the port of Honolulu or port of Lahaina. And the Hawaiian government tracked all voyages that came to Hawaii, so they kept logs of every vessel that arrived at each port, and whether it was a merchant vessel or a whaling vessel or a coasting vessel, who the captain was, the rigging of the ship, its home port, and so forth. And they tracked, in addition, every single seaman who was shipped or discharged at the Hawaiian port. And that included both native seamen as well as foreign seamen. And they kept different records for each of them, but each of them was recorded. And the government passed a series of laws beginning in the 1830s through the 19th century that dealt with the shipping and discharging of native and foreign seamen, who could ship who, whether the consul agent had the authority to ship or discharge versus the harbor master and so forth. They regulated the length of the voyage, ensuring that Hawaiians got a fair lay for pay for their voyage, any disputes and so forth. They also passed various decisions or acts that dealt with how to deal with native seamen that were stranded abroad. The government felt that if you were a whaling captain or master and you hired native seamen at the port of Honolulu, you were responsible for returning them. And your responsibility didn't disappear if you got shipwrecked, or your ship was burned, or it was crushed in the ice. You had to bring them back, and you had to pay for their return. Even if you couldn't bring them back on your vessel, you needed to have them brought back on another vessel. The only twice did the government actually step in to bring native seamen back. One was following the burning of the Pacific Fleet in 1865 by the CSS Shenandoah, which burned, I think, 33 vessels. And there were at least 1,058 crew or officers who were taken by the Shenandoah that needed to be returned. And then there was also a second time that the government dipped into the treasury, and that was in 1871 when there was a major disaster of ships stove in the ice off of Alaska. All other other instances, the government did not step in. There were other disasters, but the government said they were not going to pay for that. And so this means that you have to deal with the fact that there are Hawaiians who end up in other ports, or they end up in foreign lands and they don't have a way home. And that's something we'll touch on in a minute. And part of the reason that we have this loss of native seamen abroad is because if you think about where did the vessel originate? The vessel may have started out in New Bedford or Fall River or Nantucket, somewhere on the American East Coast. Well, their voyage was going to end there. So if they come around the Horn and they come into the Pacific and they hire native seamen here, well, they weren't planning to hire them and then make a loop back to Hawaii for the purpose of dropping them off. They still wanted those seamen on the way home. So that created a real conundrum, because when they got back to New England, they certainly weren't going to then make a voyage all the way back to Hawaii to bring back the seamen that they promised to bring back to their contract system. And yet, those Hawaiians needed to come home. And that created a real issue throughout the 19th century, particularly in the 1820 to 1850 period. So here's an example of a Hawaiian shipping article. The articles are basically it's a crew list. It is printed in both Hawaiian and English. Sometimes they were actually, both parts were filled out. Oftentimes it is only one or the other. If we look at it up close, it tells you the name of the vessel, what the home port, who the captain is, something about where they're planning to go, when they're departing, and when they are returning. And then it identifies all the crew, as well as the officers that are on board vessel, where they were shipped at, what position they held on board, and what portion, what lay they were going to get, or what portion of the catch would they receive. And they oftentimes had conditions also attached on the contract that said that the native seamen, for example, had to work so many days unpaid. Usually that had to do with preparing the ship for the voyage and then offloading the ship at the end of the voyage. So they were required to be engaged in that work, but they weren't actually paid for that work. The names of the individuals were recorded in a variety of ways. Some shipping articles, they have the individual's indigenous name. Sometimes they have that name plus a name that was assigned to them on board ship. That might be Joe Maui or Charlie or Rope Yarn or whatever. Some name that they gave them on board. So it's possible through this process to see who is identified as a native seaman versus who is not. Some of the crew lists also provide descriptions of the individuals. Their hair, their skin, their height, maybe what island they were shipped from, where they were born. So there's a lot of information available about individual seamen from the shipping articles. This is an example of a bond. So this one's rather late, but it still is the same style of bond that was used from the 1830s to the end of the whaling period. And basically, it's telling you what ship, the date of when they're being shipped, where they're going, the contract that they've entered into, how much money the bond is being posted for. And then this one, it actually has written on there that the individual came back, he was discharged before the Honolulu harbor master legally, and therefore the bond is now canceled. Bonds became really important, particularly in the second half of the 19th century, because of the loss of seamen abroad. And so, for example, in 1876, there was a disaster in the Arctic, in which 11 or 12 vessels were stowed in the ice. And one of those vessels was a Hawaiian bark named the Desmond. And Captain Green on the vessel had 18 native seamen on board and one boat steer, native boat steer. On his return, only one of them returned, and that was the boat steer. And so, obviously, if you posted $300 per man, you're looking at thousands of dollars that you're going to be out if you cannot convince the Hawaiian government that you are not responsible for them failing to return. The story is very interesting in the fact that Sanford B. Dole initiated an investigation, he conducted interviews. So we have interviews from at least 7 or 8 individuals. They're all of different nationalities. They're all people who were on board that vessel or another vessel that was stowed in the ice. And they all talk about the fact that these men chose to stay in the Arctic, and that's why they didn't return. What they don't tell you in there is that there was a mutiny. And the mutiny was based along ethnic lines. In this case, the boat steerer threatened the rest of the Hawaiian seamen to not follow the captain because the concern was that when the vessel got stowed in the ice, and if they returned with the captain, they would return with nothing. There would be no catch, therefore no lay, no pay for their work. And they felt that the captain had abandoned the vessel too early. Turns out he actually did. 60 men stayed in the Arctic that year. Only one of them returned, and he was off the Desmond. So he ended up staying in the Arctic in Newbiet Village and survived the winter, was rescued the following year. So, in terms of being able to identify native seamen, we have all sorts of resources to do that. We have all the government records from everything from the marshal's office to the port harbor master to all sorts of letters that were written to the government, letters recorded by the government, the Privy Council, and so forth. We have ship logbooks and account books. We have very few logbooks for vessels that initiated their voyage here in Honolulu, but we have thousands of logbooks for vessels that were initiated elsewhere, both in Europe and in the eastern U.S., and they have lots of references inside regarding native seamen, and they also show up in the account book. So every seaman who came on board got clothes and various articles that they had to pay for, but they were duly noted in the account book, so their names are there, where they came on board. We have journals. Obviously, we have letters, newspaper accounts, oral accounts, and some stories. So based on that, we can actually identify individual native seamen from the shipping articles and these other government records as to what vessel they were on, when did they leave, when did the vessel return, where did they go, what position did this person have. And to date, I've compiled probably somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 names of people by vessel. And then we can also look at the government records to see when they were discharged, where they were discharged. And so we know that those individuals returned. The government recorded duly, each vessel when it came in, they recorded who was on the vessel when it departed and then who was on the vessel when it returned. And so it would say this person deserted, this person died, this person fell overboard, whatever. So again, it's possible through that process to identify seamen by the vessels they were on. So there's a whole variety of records that tell us a lot about the process and whether it was working or not. So here, for example, is a letter from 1839 written by a Hawaiian in Hale. He's writing to the chiefs in Lahaina because an an orphan Hawaiian boy has been stolen and put on board ship. The captain has hidden him. The Hawaiian seamen who are on board are afraid to speak out and let them know that he's there, but they kind of secretly pass this information on. And so this information is conveyed to Lahaina with the hope that when the vessel arrives in Lahaina, that the government will step in and ensure that the boy is released. We know that Hawaiians went abroad, and a lot of them came back, but a lot of them didn't. But we also know that a lot of foreign seamen who came who were engaged in whaling and who ended up in Hawaii, some of them came and were discharged because they had completed their contract. Some were discharged because they were ill and they ended up in the Bethel or the hospital here. Others deserted. So in this case, Second Officer Daniel Lake, he was discharged. He had completed his voyage. He was discharged in 1842, and he sought officially to become a citizen of Hawaii. His citizenship application was denied, but the government regulated that he had a certain amount of time, as did any other foreign seaman who came and was legally discharged here, had a certain amount of time to enter into a new contract to go back to wherever they came from. So in this case, he has been here now for about 4 years, and his time has run out, but he's not been able to secure a voyage that he's interested in. He wants to be on a sperm whaling vessel, and there isn't one in port, so he's applied for permission. Here's an example of, again, this is called blackbirding. This is where various individuals were kidnapped and put on board whaling vessels or merchant vessels into service, and without their permission or without the permission of the captain or the chief or whoever needed to provide that permission. So we can start to, we can't necessarily identify every instance where this occurred, but we can start to see what islands this does occur on, what time period it's happening, and where these people end up. This is an example from a newspaper. This is an 1871 story in a Hawaiian language newspaper talking about problems regarding the treatment of Native Hawaiian seamen on whaling ships. So here in Hawaii, we have a wealth of information both in Hawaiian language materials and in English language materials, and they are not identical. Obviously, they provide different perspectives, they recorded different kinds of information, and and we estimate that less than, 10% of the Hawaiian language newspapers have been digitized, so very little of this resource has actually been made use of so far. But if we look at the Hawaiian language newspapers, we have two stories that are important because they are written by Native Hawaiian seamen who told their first-hand account of what was their experience on board. And so this first one, they're both written in 1877. This is the Charles Edward Kealoha. He is the individual who was on the bark Desmond, who is the only individual who survived the winter in the Arctic and returned the following year. And so he writes his story about how they became stowed in the Arctic. He writes about the mutiny, which nobody else had mentioned. He talks about what life was like in the Inupiat village. In this case, they lived at that time in semi-subterranean whalebone houses, which is something he was totally unfamiliar with. Also not prepared for the Arctic winter. And then he writes his story on his return, and it appears in the Hawaiian language newspaper. This is another story written the same time in 1877. This is about the Gili massacre at Cape Prince Wales in Alaska, and it's named after Captain Gili. And basically, this was a whaling trading vessel from Hawaii that was going to the Arctic to engage in whaling and trading with various indigenous communities. And during a trading episode, there were a number of men, women, and children from Cape Prince Wales that came on board to trade. A dispute occurred, and the Hawaiian whaling vessel crew and captain massacred all of the Cape Prince of Wales men, women, and children that they were engaged in trading in. That community today still holds stories about this incident, again providing another perspective and about what these encounters were like. And that's it. Thank you. Do you want to do questions now or after?
Up to you.
Does anybody have a question? Yes.
Of those 500 Hawaiians a year, and it went up to 1,000 a year, you know, a percentage that actually came back to the islands.
Okay, so in 1846,
Can you repeat the question?
okay, so the question is, how many of the Hawaiians who went abroad came back? So basically in the earliest years, in the 20s and 30s, we have very little data. We know that, because part of what has happened is we don't have good records here for the 1820s and 30s, so we have to look at the records for New England. And nobody's really done that in any great depth. We know that it was an issue with the Hawaiian government because in 1846, in the State of the Union address, the governor mentioned that upwards of 20% of the young men and boys aged 15 to 30 were away on whaling voyages, and he estimated at that time it was over between 400 and 500. They were still pushing for Hawaiians to engage in whaling and merchant ships and travel abroad, but they still wanted to ensure that they returned, so what they did is they actually toughened the laws by increasing the penalties. But the data from the 1840s on, we have good data to show that for that time period, they had a very high rate of return. And the reason we know that is, one, we have good records for that period, but also because starting in the 1840s, many of the voyages that Hawaiians were engaged on stayed in the Pacific. Particularly, they went off to the Okhotsk Sea, the Kamchatka, to Bering Strait, to Alaska, the Arctic, and then to California. So their voyages were shorter. So they generally were only away from 3 months to 12 months, certainly not more than 2 years. They stayed in the Pacific, so the voyages, many of them started and ended here in Hawaii. So that made it very easy to ensure their return. Okay. Yes?
Have you ever heard the story, I just learned this story recently, about 2 young girls, either teenagers or in their early 20s, that were kidnapped from Biennial?
I've heard that, but I know almost nothing beyond that. And we do know that yes, there were, like that one story, that there were various people who were kidnapped and put on board, and it included women or girls.
So the 20,000, how does that relate to total season in the Pacific? Is it 1% or 50%?
Well, if you look at the American whaling voyages alone, there were more than 27,000 American whaling voyages. So, but the American whaling started in the 17th century, but if you look at just the voyages for, say, the 19th century, I don't think anybody has tried to calculate how many of those individuals were Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. We do know that for the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, that some of those vessels were entirely native crew, or a very high percentage. But I can give you a figure. Yes?
What was the incentive for Native Hawaiians to go on these vessels?
Well, obviously adventure, obviously to bring back some resources, to make money, to bring back to support their family and their community. We know that some of them didn't return and out of choice, that they had family members who at one point ended up someplace else and they decided to join them. We know some didn't come back because they didn't have the resources to get on another vessel. We know that some of them were resourceful and tried to find ways to return. We know, for example, that a couple of them engaged in hula in Maine. They did a hula performance in an effort to fundraise to get passage to come back. So we know that these people were very industrious, that they made a lot of choices about whether to continue on a voyage. We know some of them had the opportunity to return, but chose to go with the vessel to England, for example. Some deserted, some were dumped, like the ones in Hong Kong. There are a number of people that were just simply dumped ashore someplace else, so the captain wouldn't have to pay the bond, or wouldn't have to necessarily pay them because there wasn't anybody there to assure that they had correctly paid off the receiver. Yes?
What happened to those Hawaiians that were on the ship that was stuck in frozen ice? Most of them didn't return. Did they pass away?
Yes. So the people, the 60 men that stayed behind, the bulk of them were from this one vessel, the Desmond, out of Honolulu. But the others were, some of them stayed, they were American or German or any number of nationalities. They stayed either because they were sick and they just couldn't make the trek across the ice to a vessel that could bring them back, or that they thought that their chances might be better if they stayed for the winter than risk trying to do this trek across the ice that might not be successful. So we know that the disaster in 1871 was much larger, but nobody died in that disaster. Everybody chose to make that trek and they all survived. But they didn't do that in 1876. Yes?
How many ships were captained by Hawaiians?
Well, Captain Gilly is the only one that we don't know for sure whether he's Hawaiian versus Chamorro or. But the captains, the Hawaiians that were captains on vessels that were stayed in Hawaii in terms of they were coasting vessels or whatever, inter-island coasting vessels. We don't have any that are identified as captains on the whaling vessels, even the ones that came out of the port of
So
Honolulu.
the ships were owned by wealthy merchants and shipping companies?
They were owned by a variety of people. Everything from, yes, there were certainly big industrialists or merchants. Some were owned by foreign investors, so there were ships that came out of Germany, from Bremen, the ports of Bremen and Oldenburg. There were ships from France and England and so forth. The American vessels were a mixture. Some of them were, somebody just thought that they would try their hand at whaling, and they took one voyage and were unsuccessful. Others were in families that several generations of men were captains. The ones in the Honolulu fleet here were, the majority of them were German-owned, and but the ones that were American, they were anywhere from somebody just wanted to try their luck to they were actually a ship chandlery or some sort of merchant company here that invested in the vessels. And they varied from new vessels to vessels that were totally unseaworthy. And so some did just a single voyage, some didn't even make it out of the port, others were successful in multiple voyages. there's always the question of why did Hawaiians move up in rank, and that just culturally wasn't, I mean, you don't go from being a maka'ainana, for example, to being a chief. You move up, the rank that people moved up with in terms of Pacific Islanders and Hawaiians was they moved up the rank within the categories of being a cabin boy, to being a green hand, to different ranks of seamen, to being a boat steerer, and sometimes an officer in terms of a mate. And usually one of the lower ranking mates, unless like this one vessel that Captain Billy was on, all of the ranks, everybody on board was Hawaiian, other than, we're not sure about the captain, but everybody else was Hawaiian. So that's the only voyage that we have that data